The recipients of honors are displayed as they were styled before the new honor and arranged by the country whose ministers advised the Queen on the appointments, then by honor with grades i.e. Knight, Dame Head Cross, Knight, Dame Commander, etc., and then divisions i.e. Civil, Diplomatic and Military as appropriate. United Kingdom, the Most Honourable Order of the Bath, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, Sir David Normington, KCB, Permanent Secretary, Home Office, General Sir David Julian Richards, KCB, CBE, DSO ADC Gen. Chief of the Defence Staff, Ministry of Defence. Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath Military Division, British Army, Lieutenant General David Bill, CB, Royal Air Force Air Chief Marshal Simon Bryant, CBE, ADC, Commander-in-Chief, RAF Air Command. Civil Division Stephen Charles Laws, CB, Office of the Parliamentary Council. Bruce Robinson, Head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Companion of the Order of the Bath Military Division, Royal Navy, Rear Admiral Amjad Mazar Hussain, Rear Admiral Bob Love, OBE, Army Major General Gerald Berregan, Major General Timothy Inshaw, the Venerable Archdeacon Stephen Robbins, QHC, Royal Air Force Air Marshal Chris Nichols, CBE, Air Marshal Peter Ruddock, CBE, Air Marshal David Walker, CBE, AFC, Civil Division Professor Brian Stanley Collins, Jasmine Diamond, Carolyn Downs, Andrew Gowdy, FRSE, Andrew Fleming Hind, Hilary Jackson, for Public Service, Mark Andrew Lowcock, Una O'Brien, Nigel Watkin, Robert Smith, Peter Francis Unwin, the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Sir Peter Ricketts, KCMG, currently National Security Advisor to HM Government, Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Simon Gass, CMG, CVO, Professor Eldred Parry, OBE, for services to healthcare in Africa, Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Fleur Olive Lawrence de Villiers, Alan Dost, for services to the United Nations, Michael John Drury, Caroline Elliott, OBE, Simon Featherstone, Thomas Fletcher, a former foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister, Sandy Gall, CBE, for services to the people of Afghanistan, Robert Winnington Gibson, Alistair Duaker Johnston, Andrew Lloyd, MBE, Trevor Pears, for services to the community in UK-Israel relations, Elizabeth Allison Platt, Rosemary Helen Sharp, Royal Victorian Order, Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order Sir Andrew George Buchanan BT, Her Majesty's Lord Lieutenant of Nottinghamshire, James Cropper, Her Majesty's Lord Lieutenant of Cumbria, the RT Hon, the Lord Shuttleworth, Chairman of the Council, Duchy of Lancaster, and Her Majesty's Lord Lieutenant of Lancashire. Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, Commodore Barry William Bryant, RN. Sheena Carland Cruikshank, Lord Lieutenant of Clackmannanshire, Kenneth Alastair McKinnon, Road, Lord Lieutenant of Argyll and Bute, Ian Donald McGregor LVO, Deputy Keeper of the Privy Purse, Joseph McNally, for helping youngsters develop through the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, Robert Fraser Newell LVO, Helen Joanna Page LVO, Lady-in-Waiting to the Duchess of Gloucester, Ashok Jivraj Rubheru, the Hon. William Shawcross, author of the official biography of H.M. the Queen Mother, Lieutenant of the Royal Victorian Order Colonel Richard Harold Graham, MBE, Colonel Sir William Walter Mahon, BT, Richard Francis Egerton Warburton, AO, Major Alistair Watson, Private Secretary to HRH the Duke of York, Kathleen Williams, Dr. Susan Margaret Kenyon Wilmington OBE, a formerly Home Office. Member of the Royal Victorian Order Martin William Ashley, Irene Louise Campden, William Cathcart, Richard John Carles Davison, Timothy Mark Doncaster RVM, Mark Paul Flanagan, Sergeant Danny Hill for services to royalty protection, Margaret Moran for services to the Royal Collection, Marion Louise Macaulay, Alexander Christopher de Montfort, Brian John Pickett, Julianne Sapst, Anthony Colin Shepherd, Neil Alexander Wilson, Royal Victorian Medal Andrew Botto, Constable Kenneth Wilson Coyd, Paul Denny, David Gerald Hutchins, Andrew Michael Jarvis, Linda Eleanor Jones, Roger David Williams, the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division, the RT Hon. The Earl of Selborne, KBE, for services to science, the RT Hon. The Lord Weidenfeld, for public service. Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Patricia Bacon, for services to local and national further education, and Beg MP, for services to disabled people and to equal opportunities. The Lady Antonia Fraser, CBE, for services to literature. Professor Caroline Humphrey, Lady Rees of Ludlow, for services to scholarship. Felicity Palmer, CBE, for services to music. Indira Patel, OBE, for services to human rights. Professor Helen Wallace, CMG, for services to social science. Harriet Walter, CBE, for services to drama. Susan John, MA, for services to local and national education. Head Teacher, Lambton School. Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire Military Division Royal Navy Vice Admiral Richard Geoffrey Ibbotson, CBDSEC 021702Q. Commander of the Order of the British Empire Military Division Royal Navy Commodore Michael Peter Mansberg, Royal Navy, CO25519N. Commodore Christopher Michael Howard Steele, A.D.C. Royal Navy, CO23933K. Royal Air Force Group Captain Jonathan Burr, OBE, DFC. Royal Air Force Group Captain Richard John Christopher Powell, OBE, Royal Air Force. Army Brigadier Michael Trevor Griffiths, late the King's Own Royal Border Regiment, 505,972. Colonel Robert James Herring, late the Royal Logistic Corps, 517,278. Brigadier James Ian Stewart Plastow, MBE, late the Royal Green Jackets, 507,516. Colonel Christopher Robert Francis Ryder, late the Staffordshire Regiment, 502,757. Brigadier Christopher Linley Tickle, OBE, late Corps of Royal Engineers, 517,325. Civil Division Evelyn Jean Selby Arnold, Sheila Audsley, Kirsten Baker, Francis Barron, OBE, for services to sport. Rabbi Dr. Anthony Michael Bayfield, Professor John Bennington, Professor Stephen Blackmore, George William Bolsover, Dr. Christopher Paul Hadley Brown, Ian Arthur Brown, Joseph Brown MBE, Dr. Lindsay Burley, Ravi Prakash Chand, QPM, Christopher Samuel Gordon Clark, Keith Edward Frank Clark, Andy Cole, Professor Michael John Cook, Howard Cooper, Leslie Thomas Cramp, Alison Crompton, Dr. Peter Jeffrey Cullum, Mark Damazer, for services to broadcasting, Stephen Howard Davies, for services to drama, Dr. Meenakshi Sharad Desai, for services to women's health care, Ronald James Dobson, QFSM, Gerard James Patrick Eady, Jason Feeney, Professor John Fisher, Dr. Peter Fitzgerald, Angelina Foster, David Stewart Frost, Professor Michael Gordon Fulford, Professor Hugh Charles Jonathan Godfrey, FRS, for services to science. Farah Ramzan Garland, for services to the advertising industry. Howard Lindsay Goodall, Edward Peter Gostling, Dr. Dennis Gunning, Ali Hadawi, Donna Hall, Professor Catherine Hamnett, Sheila Cameron Hancock, OBE, for services to drama. Ronald David Harker, OBE, for services to the voluntary sector. Kenneth George Harvey, for services to the utility industries. Peter Richard Head, OBE, for services to civil engineering and to the environment. Professor Graham Henderson, for services to local and national higher education. Joyce Drummond Hill, Professor Stephen Holgate, for services to clinical science. Professor Julian Morgan Hopkin, for services to medicine. Sandra Hawley, OBE, for services to the prevention of domestic violence. Trevor Charles Horn, for services to the music industry. Eileen Margaret Humphreys, OAM, for services to disadvantaged people. Edward David Brynmore Jones, for services to architecture. Lionel Joyce, OBE, for services to the administration of justice. Dr. Raymond Stewart Kelvin, for services to the fashion industry. Anthony Dennis Kennan, OBE, for services to health care. George Kerr, for services to judo. Professor Ronald Alfred Lasky, for services to science. John Hardress Wilfred Lloyd, for services to broadcasting. Rosalind Lowe, for services to health care. Christopher Colin McLehose, for services to the publishing industry. Wayne McGregor, for services to dance. Professor Quinton McKellar, for services to science. Steve Rodney McQueen, OBE, for services to visual arts. Jonathan Edward Moore, Robert Stewart Napier, for public service. Nigel Thomas Newcomen, for public service. Simon Norris, Michael John Oglesby, Hamish McGregor Ogston, Michael Antonio Parker, Dr. Richard Newton Parker, Giles Dominics and Richard Pegram. The Honourable Philip John Remnant, Robert Nigel Ricketts, Diane Mary Roberts, Dr. John Anthony Roberts, QC, DL, for services to the administration of justice, diversity and equal opportunities. Amna Rolat, Dr. Sheila Joan Shribman, Dr. Ambrose Joseph Smith, Carol Leslie Suter, Katrine Spall, David Suchet, OBE, for services to drama. Alistair John Sykes, Musji Ahmed Takolia, for services to diversity and equal opportunities. Ante, Sheila Margaret Taylor, Sarah Joanne Thornton, QPM, for services to the police. Arthur Torrington, OBE, for services to Black British Heritage. Professor Nicholas Tyler, James Whitmere, Professor John Williamson Wallace, OBE, for services to dance, music, and drama education in Scotland. Alison Jane Ward, Richard Wentworth, for services to art. The Right Reverend Martin Wharton, Graham Clive White, Brian Paul Whitaker, Tom Williams, Dr. David Wilson, for services to young people. Roger Leslie Wilson, for services to health care. Officer of the Order of the British Empire, Military Division, Royal Navy. Commander James Stephen Donnelly, Royal Navy, CO34959H. Commodore David John Evans, Royal Navy, CO23830S. Commander David John Folks, Royal Navy, CO27514V. Commander Stuart Brian Furness, Royal Navy, CO29178F. Captain Anthony Paul Holberry, Royal Navy, CO33054Q. Captain Timothy Frederick Wilkins Martin, Royal Navy, CO24445M. Commander Andrew Carnegie Stewart, Royal Navy, CO26302P. Army Colonel Colin Mark Abraham, late the Royal Logistic Corps, 513,289. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Godson Air Bartholomew, the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, 533,970. Lieutenant Colonel James Jonathan Brasher, the Yorkshire Regiment, 519,638. Colonel Charles Walter Francis Mowbray Cox, TD, late Royal Army Medical Corps, Territorial Army, 502,145. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Roy Hicks, T.D., Royal Army Medical Corps, Territorial Army, 538,502. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew James Large, Royal Corps of Signals, 551,601. Lieutenant Colonel David Humer, A.F.C. Army Air Corps, 520,191. Lieutenant Colonel Michael James Vernon Smith, Army Air Corps, 524,375. Royal Air Force Wing Commander Nigel James Coleman, Royal Air Force. Wing Commander Andrew John Coop, Royal Air Force. Group Captain Colin Hugh Hickman, Royal Air Force. Wing Commander Andrew Timothy Martin, Royal Air Force. Wing Commander Simon Christopher Pryor, Royal Air Force. Wing Commander Harvey Smith, Royal Air Force. Group Captain Ian Richard Tolfts, Royal Air Force. Civil Division Professor Muffy Calder, for services to computer science. Michael John Catt, MBE, for services to rugby. The Venerable Dr. Michael Ipgrave, for services to interfaith relations in London. Miles Jacobson, for services to the computer games industry. Herbert Kretzmer, for services to music. Herbert Quook, for services to drama. Anne Lennox, for services to Oxfam. Professor Christopher Robin Lowe, for services to science. Colin Matthews, for services to music. John Laurie Morrison, for services to art and to charity in Scotland. Vivian Mary Hunt Parry, for services to the public understanding of science. Richard Thompson, for services to music. Ronald Watt, for services to karate. Member of the Order of the British Empire Military Division, Royal Navy. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Edward Adamson, Royal Navy, CO39830F. Lieutenant Commander Reginald Paul William Bell, Royal Navy, CO26128K. Lieutenant Commander Andrew Patrick Clark, Royal Navy, CO32035C. Captain Robert Nigel Ginn, Royal Marines, NO28995V. Major Mark John Hardy, Royal Marines, NO29302Y. Lieutenant Commander Richard Simon Harrison, Royal Navy, CO37860T. Lieutenant Commander Anthony William Jervis Jenks, Royal Navy, CO22956Y. Warrant Officer Class 2 John Stuart Jones, Royal Marines, P042622P. Warrant Officer Class 1 Alistair Ian McGill, QGM, Royal Marines, P042976W. Lieutenant Commander Paul Nimmins, Royal Navy, CO37084V. Lieutenant Commander Jack Rickard, Royal Navy, CO40630N. Chief Petty Officer William Sharp, D190784G. Warrant Officer Class 1 Ronald Sinclair, Royal Marines, P041506G. Lieutenant Rachel Smallwood, Royal Navy, VO31154D. Colour Sergeant Laird Webster, Royal Marines, P046816C. Army Lieutenant Colonel Philip John Abram, Royal Corps of Signals, 533,967. Major Jeremy Baird Barron, the Royal Irish Regiment, 547,856. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Julian Bateman, the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, 536,330. Major James Richard Brydon, the Yorkshire Regiment, 536,332. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Edward George Caldecott, the Royal Logistic Corps, 537,394. Major Andrew John Serson, Adjutant General's Corps, Territorial Army, 542,568. Major John Lockhart Clark, Corps of Royal Engineers, 548,496. Major Andrew Robert DeVay, Corps of Royal Engineers, 535,769. Acting Lieutenant Colonel James McShane Doherty, West Lowland Army Cadet Force, 501,766. Major Simon John Doyle, the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, 551,274. Chaplain to the Forces Ian Robert Gamble, Royal Army Chaplains' Department, Territorial Army, 553,036. Captain Andrew Stephen G., the Royal Logistic Corps, 24,754,533. Captain Robert N. Martin Gillespie, the Royal Irish Regiment, 24,757,108. Warrant Officer Class 2 David Allen Hummerston, the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, 24,738,024. Major Samuel Leslie Humphreys, the Yorkshire Regiment, 548,954. Major Toby Clive Main Prize King Jackman, the Royal Gurkha Rifles, 536,648. Captain James Andrew Keeley, Grenadier Guards, 24,723,165. Major Andrew Gordon Lewis, the Royal Logistic Corps, 536,679. Captain Noel Robert Henry McGill, the Mercian Regiment, 24,779,477. Captain Keith John Mahoney, the Mercian Regiment, Territorial Army, 548,445. Captain Craig Alexander McBurney, the Rifles, 24,721,630. Captain Ian Stephen Moore, the Royal Welsh Territorial Army, 565,487. Major Nicholas Paul Mott, Welsh Guards, 559,868. Colour Sergeant John Paul Myers, Welsh Guards, 24,908,590. Lieutenant Colonel Sean Howard Neal, Royal Regiment of Artillery, Territorial Army, 533,596. Captain Simon Leslie John Oliver, Royal Regiment of Artillery, 24,759,786. Captain Andrew Pemberton, the Rifles, 24,748,173. Captain Clive Terence Phillimore, the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, Territorial Army, 563,012. Sergeant Sean Peter Powell, Corps of Royal Engineers, 25,027,396. Warrant Officer Class 2 Wesley Robert Quigley, Royal Army Veterinary Corps, 24,851,955. Captain Michael Reed, the Light Dragoons, 566,560. Warrant Officer Class 1 Nicola Seymour, Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps, Q10250111. Captain J. Shaw, the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, 24,631,766. Warrant Officer Class 2 Paul Andrew Simpson, Corps of Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, 24,678,839. Captain Andrew John Slater, Q. G.M., the Parachute Regiment, 24,683,477. Staff Sergeant Robert Smith, the Royal Logistic Corps, 24,714,045. Major David Mark Stanbridge, Q. G.M., the Parachute Regiment, 553,470. Chaplain to the Forces Alan Christopher Steele, Royal Army Chaplains Department, 550,177. Major Stephen Brian Sutherland, the Royal Logistic Corps, 544,118. Captain Mark Robert Todd, Royal Corps of Signals, 24,697,151. Major Mark William Torpey, A.F.M., Army Air Corps, 541,848. Warrant Officer Class 2 Raymond Allen Wall, the Parachute Regiment, 24,645,789. Royal Air Force Squadron Leader Gary Donovan, Royal Air Force. Corporal Karen Elizabeth Edwards, Royal Air Force. Master Aircrew Andrew Michael Gillett, Royal Air Force. The Reverend Ruth Victoria Hake, Royal Air Force. Corporal Christian Lawrence Harrison, Royal Air Force. Squadron Leader Richard James Hillett, Royal Air Force. Master Aircrew Darren Isaac, Royal Air Force. Flight Sergeant Richard Leslie Knowles, Royal Air Force. Flight Lieutenant Jacqueline Aileen MacDonald, Royal Air Force. Sergeant John McClymont, Royal Air Force. Warrant Officer Christopher Charles Miles, Royal Air Force. Squadron Leader Paul Michael Rose, Royal Air Force. Squadron Leader Stephen Stanton, Royal Air Force Reserve. Warrant Officer Derek Wintrip, Royal Air Force. The Reverend Edward Lawrence Wynne, Royal Air Force. Civil Division Paul Andrew Davis for services to wheelchair rugby. Barry Spencer Layton for services to the fashion industry. Graham McDowell for services to golf. Beatrix Ong for services to the fashion industry. Dr. Katie Petty-Siphon, Director, Medical Schools Council, Dental Schools Council and Association of UK University Hospitals, for services to medicine. Ronald Ross for services to Shinty in Scotland. Peter Michael Walker for services to cricket. Howard Melton Webb for services to football. Julia Sandra Ailsa Malkin approved driving instructor, for services to people with special needs. Asley Pitter for combating homophobia in London. Chris Green MBE for services to education through 8 and summer camps. Mrs. Constance Winifred Foster for services to the community in the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. Royal Red Cross. Royal Red Cross Royal Navy Chief Petty Officer Naval Nurse Louise Stephanie Speller QARNNS. Royal Air Force Flight Lieutenant Anthony Winton Nicol. Queen's Police Medal England and Wales Ian Arundale. Stephen Richard Armstead. Hamish Campbell. Dominic Victor Clout. Robert Charles Dyson. Julian Grant. Roderick Charles Jarmin. David Kelly. Helen King, Neil Kinraid, Christina Maria Wilson Law, Stephen Love, Ivor John McGregor, Brian Arthur McNeil, Janet Malloy, Joseph Murray, Andrew John Walker Parker, Mark Rowley, Scotland Ian MacLeod, Neil Allen Richardson, Kevin Smith, Northern Ireland Linda Elizabeth Baird, Tim Hanley, Paul Hannigan, Queen's Fire Service Medal England and Wales John Anthony Boyce, Richard Hannigan, Robert Neil Proudfoot, Scotland James Reed Clark, David Smith, Northern Ireland Brian Thompson McClintock, the Queen's Volunteer Reserves Medal Army Sergeant Robert Cullen Michael Burns, Captain Sean David Lamming, Major Michael Paul Rowe, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Lewis Sheaf, TD, Colonial Police Medal Keith Lee Valentine Benjamin, Royal Anguilla Police Service, Joseph Anthony Gomez, Royal Gibraltar Police.